Hello there everyone. So recently, if you've been following this channel, you saw the video written and created by Filthy Heretic known as, Yes, Police Are the Bad Guys, in which he is responding to a video created by a user named Rational Outlaw who is attempting to rebut the series on Heretic's original channel explaining the inherent criminality of police, which, by the way, is a great series of videos and I'd recommend anyone to go watch them. I'll leave links for anyone who's looking to do so in the pinned comment. So, Rational Outlaw created a new response to Filthy's response, which was a response to his response to a response to common arguments, assertions, and narratives which underlie arguments in favor of government police, which Filthy understandably doesn't want to respond to because, first of all, he's not autistic enough to make a response to a response to a response to a response to a response, but, also, he doesn't want his work to be nothing but replies to Rational Outlaw. He's getting a bit burnt out on the subject. I, on the other hand, have been slacking quite a bit in the content I've been uploading and writing in the last few months, and there are a plethora of reasons for why that is, but overall, it's been a very long time since I've made a good old-fashioned commentary video, so I would love to respond just because of how fucking awful I find the arguments in Rational Outlaw's reply to be. On top of that, it turns out that a few months ago, our favorite outlaw created a video which was a response to a video which I wrote a while ago critiquing Minarchism and explaining how it's both not a real definable political affiliation, and also that there exists no continuity between the ideas promoted by self-proclaimed minarchists and libertarians, despite many minarchists attempting to bill themselves as libertarians. So I'm going to be replying to both of these videos, and because I didn't know how to frame my transition into starting worth a damn, I decided to run a poll regarding which of these videos you wanted to see first, and to create the illusion that audience participation is a factor in deciding what my next course of action will be regarding the material that I write. So it looks like part 1 here will be a response to Does Minarchism Exist? Which is probably what I would have chosen anyway, given that I want to create some space between my response and the previous video Filthy made about cops before we talk about police again on this channel. Anyway,
Hey, so tell me if you've heard this one before.
While I agree that this house is on fire, we can't put out the house fire entirely because if we do, then there would be a chance it could burn down.
No, you haven't heard this before because it's completely asinine and makes no sense whatsoever. Well, that's effectively the minarchist argument for the state.
Mr. Strawman, give me a break!
in what way was that even remotely a mischaracterization of the minarchist approach to analyzing state violence and political rule? Most minarchists generally present their arguments under the pretense of state skepticism, and seem to have a rudimentary understanding of political rule being a negative thing, although there are many regular party-archists whose beliefs don't differ even remotely from that of mainstream conservatism, and just identify with the term because they find it to be an edgier label. More on that in a moment. But even though their arguments and premises which make them up, as I'm about to go over, are incomplete at best and are conceptually flawed, minarchists at least recognize that there exists valid reason to be skeptical of political rule, that politicians tend to expand state influence over society in pursuit of their own interests, along with how this creates culturally dysgenic effects on how people in society evaluate their own interests. interests, and in the material scarcity this creates, negatively impacting the livelihood of non-state actors. So while one could argue that it's a bit unspecific to equate political rule and society to a house which is burning and a group of firefighters deciding what to do in order to put out the house fire, this is nearly verbatim the minarchist argument as even minarchists frame it.
That is a way oversimplified definition of minarchism. Minarchism is so that the society does not devolve into extreme authoritarianism. Minarchists see the nature of humanity and believe that if left without any form of structure that is even just minimal, it will develop into a more tyrannical form of government for those people. Now, obviously, a minarchist government can become a tyrannical government over time. However, that doesn't mean it doesn't work. You just have to have a vigilant watch over it.
Oh, okay, so I didn't mischaracterize the minarchist argument for the state. You just don't like that I shed light on how illogical your position is by presenting a metaphor which represents exactly what you're proposing without the misleading euphemisms that tautologically structure your argument in a way where the premise assumes your conclusion is correct in its conception, or redefining words and concepts in order to equate entirely incompatible subjects as to try and obscure the evident logical problems presented when attempting to reach certain conclusions with certain means. But we've already arrived at the main problem with this video and minarchism in general as a political position in just the first response from Outlaw. There are numerous issues with the argument proposed in just about every angle you approach it from. Firstly,
so that the society does not devolve into extreme authoritarianism.
Is not the definition of minarchism. That is, again, just you poisoning the well by assuming your proposed conclusion in the premise of your argument so that you can hand-wave away criticism when presented by claiming that your critics' arguments are based on an improper representation of the minarchist position. I'm sure you could see the problems with this because you've essentially defined your argument in a way where no angle of it can be challenged, rhetorically speaking, without conflicting with the premise of your argument. Also, I'm glad that someone finally pulled this on me because I find citing the dictionary definition of a word which is meant to colloquially represent a concept as a rebuttal or counter-argument to another person's claims or criticisms to be one of the most ham-fisted anti-intellectual regresses that another person can put forward in a discussion. Dictionary definitions at best can only be employed to explain how a word is colloquially used. In other words, how the term is regularly used in most discussions and is known for referring to. And citing this in the middle of a debate creates a series of issues. If the problem with the idea being conveyed is that its definition introduces more vaguity than explanation, in other words, the debate in question is initially over the concept's validity itself, you know, as every debate about politics necessarily has to be, then all citing the dictionary does is push the problem a step back and does nothing to address the criticisms presented by the other party, and in the case of anti-concepts such as socialism or capitalism, can actually create more questions than answers. And on top of that, there's the fact that how information is interpreted by each individual person is relative unless there is a cohesive underlying framework through which the presentation of said information is being conveyed through. Dictionaries specifically seek to remove any such narrative structures in defining their terms. In other words, citing dictionary definitions for political discussion actually makes debate on any topic less coherent, because by appealing to the dictionary, you automatically reintroduce the problem of skepticism. In other words, how I can discern something as being true from untrue, which is otherwise eliminated through the presentation of supporting observation-based evidence and/or reasoning. This is because you make the argument entirely presuppositional by eliminating the ability for it to be falsified, and as a result, you make any discussion from this point forward entirely entirely meritless, since arguments which can't be falsified can't be used to demonstrate anything because they can't work as a refutation towards claims to the contrary. There's no actual evidence or tangible reason which one could point to and demonstrate for why your position should be believed as you're arguing for it. It's the equivalent ultimately of saying, I'm right because I said so, but disguised as a substantive counter-argument. Now, the reason self-proclaimed minarchists don't spend too much time and effort explaining the premise, practicality, or metaphysical consistency and implications of evaluating whether or not political rule is valid based on the scale on which it functions is because the merit of this position falls apart under even the most minute of scrutiny. Firstly, there's the fundamental assumption their position takes, which is that a government which operates at a small scale is more ethical than governments which operate at a larger scale, and how a government operates as an existential entity, the actions of which are decided by the perspectives of people who rule over the government in a vacuum. First of all, scale of operation in terms of size and influence over the political economy or society of any given state cannot be the basis to define the ethical nature of the state. For one thing, this approach is entirely dependent on the existence of other states to be made. As to assume this premise, the only way you could establish a difference in the ethical nature of a state from this perspective would be to compare that state to another state. If there exists no second state for the state to be analyzed in comparison to, this approach becomes impossible to establish. So there's no established or establishable size or influence over society which one could tangibly cite as being the point where a state becomes more or less authoritarian. Authoritarianism feasibly can exist whether or not there's another entity exercising political rule. Also, specifically in terms of measuring influence over society or how much the state involves itself in the political economy, this is an entirely arbitrary analysis. Let's say hypothetically that there were only two governments in the world. One of them taxed 90% of the wealth produced by all the people it claimed the legitimacy to rule over, and killed people for being gay in public. The other one taxed 85% of the wealth created by all the people it claimed to rule over, and only killed 1/4 of the people who were found to be gay in public. According to the minarchist approach, the latter would be considered a small government, even though it's publicly executing people for non-violent actions as part of its socio-political order, and is plundering 85% of the wealth created by the people it claims to rule over. Or what about completely ignoring the influence over the market? What if you were to simply compare two governments from this approach from a perspective of civil rights? Not to imply that freedom of association and the products of your agency aren't rights. I'm just lacking better words to describe this. Anyway, what if one government killed people for being gay in public, but the other killed people who smoked weed in public, but not for being gay? How, from this perspective of scale, in this regard, would you determine that one government is more or less criminal than the other by a measure of scale? Sure, the crimes which are committed tell us different things about the structural incentives of certain models of state organizing, or on an individual basis, the said individual's internalized worldview along with some of their motivations, but aggression doesn't scale in severity. For one, this argument has the same problem fundamentally as the argument that government authoritarianism operates around a scale in severity, in that it requires every crime to be compared to another crime to even conceptually work, even though each act of aggression occurs between one aggressor and one victim on an individual basis. The other problem with this notion is that it assumes that there exists an external standard separated from the action and actual damage to the victim, which each act of aggression themselves revolve around, which all crimes are measured by, and which determines what a crime even is. I'm starting to go off on a tangent, so if you want to see a more detailed explanation of justice without a state, or why the fundamental assumptions which justifications for the rule of law and the standard of evaluating criminality are based on are flawed, then see my video, Justice Without a State, or Shane Killian's explanation of natural law, all of which will be located in the pinned comment. Basic TLDR explanation, though, of the point I want to establish here. In all crimes, there's an individual victim party and an individual aggressor. Therefore, in each crime uniquely, the victim is going to have different standards for compensation because what the criminal did and how it impacted the victim is going to change both around circumstance and marginal preference. As a result, even ignoring the ethical problems created by monopolized arbitration, which, believe me, we'll be going over in greater detail later, the rule of law necessarily as a standard of justice has to discriminate disproportionately either in compensation of the victim or in unfairly penalizing the criminal party, because in attempting to establish a standard of ruling separated from the actual actions of the parties involved in each dispute, the information input from the parties involved in each dispute are neglected, and consequently the victim is not compensated, and what happens to the criminal is entirely arbitrary, or whether or not there even is determined to be a victim or a criminal is entirely arbitrary. In fact, for the most part, arbitration in state societies is more centered around just trying to create more revenue for the state by taking as much from the criminal party as possible. In most cases, the victim isn't even represented, and that's assuming there actually is a victim, which in the majority of cases there isn't even a victim. So there is again no objective scale one could point to, even aside from ethics, which crime operates around. But even assuming there was, someone committing more crimes wouldn't make someone who's committed fewer crimes more ethical or less of an aggressor. They're both aggressors, one just has more victims to compensate than the other. But suppose you were to look past the fact that the minarchist analysis of the nature of political rule and ethical claims at its presuppositional core is addlepated beyond salvation, and look at the other noted assumptions made in framing this argument. But for the sake of time, we'll stick specifically to the argument which Outlaw attempts to establish here, that without a state, society would develop another state, and then we wouldn't have freedom. Yeah, that's not even remotely a good argument, like, even for statism. First of all, you have to stand back with some sense of awe at the basic formal logic structure of this claim. Of course, not that this is a compelling argument, it's just genuinely amazing that there are actually people who have internalized a position like this, and think that it makes sense with how transparently broken it is. Now, some of the worst problems with this argument, when stripped down to its basic core, should be immediately noticeable. Mainly, it's assumed that both A and B necessarily have to exist simultaneously, even though it's implied that B and A are not only separate, but are directly antagonistic towards the established character traits of one another, and therefore an argument for B in this context is necessarily not an argument in favor of A, because if B exists, then B is ensuring that A cannot be realized. Or, to step outside of the strictly analytical approach for a moment, to argue that without a state you would be oppressed because another state would form is necessarily not an argument in favor of freedom. In fact, this argument by implication concedes one of the fundamental libertarian anarchist premises, which is that government, by its mere existence in any form, is an affront to human rights. So the general point which statists are attempting to establish with this argument is self-defeating, and the core assumptions made in proposing this argument aren't even structurally sound, for reasons we've already gone over, but also, even the idea that a free society can, through purely voluntary means, establish a state doesn't seem to hold up to basic scrutiny. The idea that a corporation, warlords, or whatever variation of the bad guys are proposed in any version of this scenario would become the new state once the current state is gone, either because they obtain a large amount of market share, or by using force to suppress the human rights of the society in question. This mainly falls apart once you factor in the existence of diseconomy of scale. In other words, the effect of it becoming increasingly difficult for firms to internally manage their own resources as the amount of resources which the said firm manage scales upward, and competitive disadvantages arise both as the market share of such a firm and the amount of resources required to manage assets within the firm increases. Anyone who's ever worked at any S&P 500 corporation at any level has seen this firsthand. For instance, two managers give orders with what to do with merchandise or product placements which contradict one another, or you follow one order only to be told immediately to undo everything. I used to work at Walmart. That happened to me more times than I'd care to admit. This occurs for two main reasons, though there are others. Firstly, as the amount of resources scale upward, the amount of input required to manage said resources increases. And as input for internal management increases, it becomes more difficult to efficiently allocate resources because it becomes increasingly difficult to factor in all of the necessary factors required for price calculation to be taken into equation. The second reason is not necessarily mutually exclusive from the first, but as firms start having to manage more resources internally, the upper positions in the firm begin to have increasing difficulty internalizing information which is necessary to factor into economic calculation, since there is more managerial bureaucracy creating a greater number of ways information can be interpreted, influenced by an increasingly large number of factors. But also there is a much more defined structural disincentive for people in lower positions of the firm's management hierarchy to convey certain bits of information which would be necessary to create a more accurate allocation of the resources the firm has in question, since the firm's bureaucracy can't properly evaluate the marginal product created by each individual worker, and as such, there is greater pressure on each worker to maintain the appearance of performing to a certain level. In fact, because larger firms have so many resources to allocate, the management creates direct penalties for not performing tasks in a certain manner within a certain frame of time, such as the threat of being written up, having your pay docked, or being fired altogether. A business itself becoming a state apparatus is functionally impossible, and these big corporations which exist as of right now are not actually an approximation of free market firms. They themselves are beneficiaries which operate around protectionist state privilege established in order to exempt them from competition through various means, and externalize various costs these firms would otherwise have to take into account for when managing their own assets, which incentivizes them to buy more resources than they otherwise would be able to afford. Broadly, this is done through both direct and indirect subsidy, regulatory capture, which creates artificial costs for operating a business that raises the barrier of entry for competitors to that market in question, and finance manipulation, where the state takes measures to manipulate credit ratings in order to either incentivize or disincentivize financial institutions to associate with or form associations with certain firms or models of organization. Even if it was possible, though, to have a small amount of firms or a single firm obtain the vast majority of the market share for a certain industry, well, then you'd run into the fundamental issue with monopolies, or just generally a market where the number of firms that supply commodities are incredibly limited, which is that because there are so few inputs from consumers for how to efficiently price commodities, these firms have an increasingly difficult time calculating manipulating prices, which creates a strong incentive for entrepreneurs to enter the market as competitors and either undercut the competition or to create a subversive new commodity or model of organization which undermines the other firm's market or model. And on top of that, such firms would necessarily, after obtaining such a large chunk of the society in question's market share, begin having to spend more on trade because they'd have to spend more on distributing their commodities over a wider geographical area. The reason I bring this up is because I know that if I don't, someone's going to appeal to the economy of scale argument, which statists occasionally use to justify the state's intervention into the market. So I'd like to acknowledge in advance the fact that economies of scale themselves result in diseconomies of scale. Now, there's a second variation of this argument, which I think is the one particularly that was being emphasized here, that without a state, a bunch of warlords would create armies and use that force to form another state. Filthy Heretic has already made 2 videos going over how this argument doesn't stand up to scrutiny, so I won't go into as much detail as I could, but this argument generally is pretty flawed and it's worth going over. It doesn't take into consideration that historically decentralized non-state militias and informal community defense have been far more effective of means of defending society, and the United States government itself has implicitly acknowledged this when in both the Vietnam War and World War II, the CIA manufactured cheap disposable pistols to be distributed to the populations of occupied territories for the stated strategic purpose of creating an element of psychological warfare. This argument also completely ignores the direct incentives that every single person in a stateless world would have in defending their property from the one aggressing firm. Hell, even if it were multiple firms conspiring, the population which they're directly and openly threatening the internalized interests of dwarfs whatever army they could possibly put together, and if there were multiple security firms forming a trust, that would create another incentive problem where all the firms may have a joint interest in maintaining the trust, but every single one of them has an individual interest in breaking from the trust and working against the other firms, which in this case would mean fighting against them and making their cause more difficult. But there's another question here which is seemingly never asked by the Minarchists, which is how fundamentally can you claim that governments are any different than the warlord tyrant you've conceptualized in your unrealistic nightmare picture of an anarchist society? The truth is, there really isn't a tangible difference one could point to. Both of them do whatever they want with no real tangible accountability. Both have direct structural incentives to antagonize the populations they claim dominion over. Both of them will force people to associate with them and kill or kidnap anyone who doesn't, with the only real consistency in their actions being the pursuit of whatever they deem to be their own material interests. Because governments are a coercive monopoly on arbitration, aside from all of the aforementioned facts, whatever you think the government should do will only ever tangibly exist in philosophical models too disconnected from reality to ever be realized outside of the realm of abstract academic discussion, unless what you want is the state to do whatever the state deems to be in its own interests, which, considering that in order for the state to have its interests met, it needs to initiate force and steal resources from people, this necessarily means that the state is not only incentivized to engage in aggression, but also to directly antagonize the interests of people it claims the legitimacy of ruling over. So that's not a really consistent position you could argue for, even in concept. If there was no use of theft to fund the state, by the way, then there could be no monopoly on arbitration, which means there could be no state. So you can't pull a Ron Paul and try and worm your way out of this one by introducing the idea of voluntary government into the discussion. In fact, the way pretty much all arguments for the legitimacy of political rule or state violence are structured are deliberately designed to rhetorically disguise the explicit call for arbitrary violence around euphemisms which are intended to make what is being argued for sound as if it's a non-aggressive, consensus-based action that every member of the society or community in question engages in, or in their premise to uncritically assert that what they're proposing will do what they're claiming it does, which conveniently protects the statist worldview from having to address the atrocity-tier dystopian madness their arguments naturally imply, and how illogical their arguments self-evidently are if taken to their conclusions or stacked up against tangible observations. Point is, though, you cannot have rights or consistency in a state society. All legislative fiat which makes up what a law is in a state society is entirely arbitrary, because there's only one organization which can engage in arbitration, which every person is forced to associate with and is stolen from to fund, and the only consistency which makes up what determines the law and how the state uses violence to enforce that legislative fiat is whatever is deemed necessary for the state to establish a socio-political order by the politicians to ensure that there is a perception of asset security within the political economy. But even getting past the fact that states only really have an incentive to use violence when it serves their interests, which is provably always going to be antagonistic towards the interests of non-state actors, it's not even conceptually sound to argue that law can only exist if there is legislative fiat. No one here is arguing against the fact that rights exist or that rights can't be arbitrary, but the problem is there is no argument for this position while operating around the notion that political rule can be legitimate. Even if you were to disregard all of the previously noted incentive problems and inconsistencies which ensure that the legal order cannot be cohesively defined with a monopoly on arbitration ruling over society, and which ensure that any constitution which is established can be and regularly are/were by all states which have ever existed throughout history disobeyed, there are various conceptual issues with this position. Firstly, I know that I find myself saying this quite a bit on this channel, but it cannot be overstated because it's easily the most common mistake I find in arguments which I critique. There is no objective way to internalize information. That doesn't mean there's no objective information, or that there's no such thing as an objective fact. It means that how people perceive information and convey information are informed by internal narratives which make up their own relative framework of the world. Now, this creates a big problem for constitutionalism, because if what the Constitution says is relative to each person who reads it, then it's necessarily impossible for every single person to derive the same exact principles or meaning from a constitution, which means that there's no way to establish any first principles from constitutional legislative fiat. But even ignoring that, let's take everything minarchists argue for as they argue for it at face value for the sake of argument. The state isn't dependent on aggression by its very nature, it does have an interest, or is even capable of serving the perceived interests of the people it claims to rule over, even though they have no recourse against not doing so. The state has a direct disincentive from doing so. Legislative fiat can be objective, and that the state is the only way to have law. What happens if the state does violate the legislative fiat which it created? Well, then there's only two possible conclusions you could derive from this. Either the Constitution did nothing to stop the state from engaging in criminality, or it enabled the state to engage in criminality. So, your only possibility here would be to reject the state as illegitimate, unless you're going to argue that the state can't commit any crimes, in which case you're either arguing that criminality doesn't exist, or you're saying that governments just can't commit crimes. And I really shouldn't have to explain the problems with either of those two positions.
And technically speaking, there's no such thing as anarchists. whether you like it or not, you're going to have some form of ruler.
You know, regardless of your thoughts on religion or the state, it's been noted that arguments for creationism against non-religious people, or people who just generally dispute their creation myths, and political rule share a striking number of similarities in a number of different ways, and I find that statists are proposing arguments which mirror those of creationist arguments in an increasing frequency as of late in an increasingly broader set of applications. And now it appears that they've gotten to their equivalent of there's no such thing as an atheist because all atheists need faith in the non-existence of a creator. Also, regardless of your position on the legitimacy of political rule, this is exactly why minarchism isn't compatible with libertarianism. Libertarianism is a philosophy which rejects all political rule because its fundamental first principles argue that because every single person is a moral agent, they are therefore entitled to all the products of their agency, which would make it incoherent for someone to argue that moral agents can claim ownership over other moral agents, which is exactly what an act of aggression entails. Minarchism accepts political rule as being legitimate, which automatically means that it can not only not have any continuity with libertarianism, but also that it isn't even really a philosophy, because as noted earlier, there's no definable first principles which political rule operate around. Political rule can only be said for certain to operate around the basis of might makes right, and the problem with this position is that it fails to the demarcation problem. In other words, it can argue for any position up to and including self-contradictory positions, and consequently it can't be used to define anything because it can't negate anything. So, minarchism, and really any philosophy which attempts to justify the existence of political rule, aren't coherent philosophies. They are preference-based opinions which are presuppositionally disguised as philosophies that have an actual truth claim. As for a specific rebuttal to this argument, well, all we need to do to refute this claim, as noted, is to prove that agency exists, and obviously agency exists, otherwise we'd all be mindless automatons.
Anarcho-capitalism is really just a critarchy, rule by judges. These judges will rule on laws, punishments, and enforcement of those punishments and laws.
Imagine your criticism of anarchy literally just being a description of the state with the word anarchy slapped on it. Anyway, I've already refuted this critarchy argument in detail in my response to Turd Flinging Monkey, which is apparently the video that this rational outlaw decided to base this claim off of. Anyway, I think surprisingly I've already covered all of the arguments that are going to be presented here. So, next time, whenever I decide to record part 2 of this series, we're going to be going over his response to Filthy Heretic on the nature of police and the state. Time for some patron questions! Faithless Berserker asks, well, I don't need to read that because it's on screen, and I also don't want to read that because of YouTube's algorithms. Anyway, yeah, way to ask the awkward questions I'd really rather not answer. I suppose they do need to be answered, though, so that people know how to respond to these if some shithead throws this out because they're losing a debate as a way to subtly imply character assassination. And no, none of these things are an act of aggression because none of them produce a definitive victim. And to base whether or not something is criminal on the chance that doing it or using something can aggress upon another person would logically conclude with everything being an act of aggression. To clarify, though, all of these positions I and most other people, presumably yourself included, would consider to be vices. The first being just tragic, and the latter two being incredibly disgusting for entirely different reasons. Now, because something isn't a crime and people don't have any justification in using violence to stop someone from doing something, does not mean that it is okay, so to speak, or or that a stateless society won't have cultural standards that disincentivize certain vices, particularly those which carry high risk to damaging oneself or others. And all state aggression against these behaviors serves as is another way in which the state doesn't really give a fuck as long as they can use said laws as an excuse to steal more money and create more debt for people which they would owe to the state. And if someone wants to fuck their cousin badly enough that state aggression isn't going to deter them, there's really not anything that the state would be able to do about it. So literally, even in a state society, the only thing which, for the most part, is stopping people from doing this more broadly is social stigma. In other words, consensus that these are bad things and most people don't individually have an interest in being around people who do these things. So, in other words, how you would deal with problems in an anarchy. Well, social problems that don't actually have a victim, that is, anyway. But yeah, I wouldn't start an argument in favor of libertarian ethics with state aggression being bad by pointing to the example of incest relationships or drinking alcohol while you're pregnant. Anyway, that's all for today's video. If you liked it, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.